Well, I think the response by President Biden and the administration and leading Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, the highest ranking Jewish official in American history, has been tepid at best.
New York Republican Congressman Mike Lawler.
And really is a failure of leadership on a number of levels, obviously, starting with these institutions of higher learning. These college and university presidents have failed in their obligations to ensure the safety and well-being of all students. And I think within the Democratic Party, you see a fracture. You see, electoral political considerations taking more precedent over the safety and well-being of Jewish Americans. And I think it's wrong. Obviously, we can sit and debate policy of the Israeli government. We can sit and debate the situation in the Middle East. But when these protests turn anti-Semitic, when they turn violent, when that violence intimidates and threatens Jewish students, it's wholly unacceptable. And it requires leadership at every level to not only condemn it, but to act. And I think that's, I went to Columbia. I met with President Shafik. I made it very clear that they needed to crack down on this. I called for her resignation. And last week, we passed my bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which will require the Department of Education to use the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism when, prosecuting these Title VI violations of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Congressman, everywhere I go, I get the question of who is funding these protests. So I'll ask you the question, do you think perhaps it's a foreign adversary trying to stir division in this country?
Well, look at the situation with respect to TikTok, right? And the concerns that many of us in Congress have had with respect to the Chinese Communist Party and how they utilize that app to not only collect data on Americans, but manipulate our young people. And you look at these protests on college campuses, you see they involve paid agitators. They involve people who are not students at these universities. There's a very coordinated effort across the board. And on some of the reporting that we've seen, you have these left-wing organizations funded by George Soros, funded by David Rockefeller, and other left-wing billionaires, many of whom, by the way, support Joe Biden. And so it's disconcerting, to say the least. And obviously, I think there needs to be further investigation as to where the funding is coming from and why these protests are being funded by these left-wing organizations.
House Republicans are digging in, taking a closer look at college funding by the federal government amid these protests. What are you and your colleagues hoping to find as you look into this issue?
Well, obviously, we want to make sure that there's not nefarious purposes going on here with respect to where these funds are coming from. Some of these institutions take significant money from foreign governments, and that's something that we should really be looking at. We should be looking at their endowments. We should be looking at the fact that the federal government spends billions of dollars on education, and these institutions are not enforcing the law with respect to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and discrimination on their campuses. And so, this is something where Speaker Johnson announced we're going to be taking a much broader look at what is happening on these college campuses. Multiple committees will be involved in this investigation. And I think it's incumbent on Congress to act. One of the bills that I had previously introduced would defund institutions of higher learning if they promote or sanction anti-Semitic events on their campuses. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing across the board.
You sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What updates can you share about the war against Israel, and how likely is a ceasefire with hostages returning to Israel and the United States?
Well, obviously, we still have Americans and Israeli citizens and citizens from other countries as well that are being held hostage. Hamas has refused to agree to release these hostages, which is why there's not a ceasefire. As I've said many times, the fastest way for a ceasefire to occur is for Hamas to surrender and the hostages to be released. The failure to do that is what is allowing this war to continue. Obviously, the administration has been working to try and negotiate, working with the Qatari government. as well as Egypt and other allies, to try and negotiate the release of these hostages. But Israel, my bottom line is Israel has a right to defend itself. Nobody would tell the United States after 9/11 that we should have a ceasefire with Al Qaeda. Ultimately, terrorism needs to be rooted out. It is a vile stain on our society, on our world, and you're dealing with individuals who don't want peace, and they don't believe in Israel's fundamental right to exist. And so, when you're dealing with that situation, it's kind of hard to negotiate a peace agreement.
Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, testified this past week that the war in Ukraine is unlikely to end anytime soon. What is your assessment? Do you agree with her?
Well, obviously, Vladimir Putin continues his march to try and take control of Ukraine, which would have dire consequences around the globe. You have an unholy alliance between China, Russia, and Iran, and they are seeking to undermine and destabilize the United States, Europe, and the free world. And so, ultimately, this is a battle of good versus evil, and Ukraine needs to continue to defend itself. Obviously, we have passed, funds to support them in that effort, but this is important not just to Ukraine, but to the U.S. and Europe. And so, look, right now, I think now that the foreign aid package is passed, the question is, how do we get to a place of success in Ukraine, and what does that look like? And I think the administration needs to do a much better job of defining that and working with Congress to make sure that we are successful in Ukraine and what that may look like. But, certainly for the time being, there is not a negotiated settlement. And so, this war is going to continue in Ukraine.
The crisis at our southern border has been a red-hot issue for the past few years since we are in political season ahead of the presidential election when the entire House of Representatives is on the ballot. Do you expect that this will get passed on to the next administration, whether it be Biden 2.0 or Trump 2.0, to figure out?
Well, look, this is a crisis of Joe Biden's own making by reversing so many of the policies of the Trump administration. We've seen the floodgates open at our southern border, over 10 million migrants since Joe Biden took office. This is his mess that he created. The House has acted. We have passed H.R. 2. We have passed a number of measures dealing with the border. And Chuck Schumer and Senate Democrats for almost a year now have refused to take up H.R. 2. They have not passed a border security package through the Senate. We have. And so I do believe, based on the Biden administration's refusal to secure our borders, refusal to enforce customs and immigration law, catch and release, which is an absolute disaster. Yes, it will be on the next administration to deal with this because Senate Democrats and Joe Biden refuse to act.
House Speaker Mike Johnson is expected to face a challenge this week from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, trying to move to make the motion to vacate the speakership this week. What do you think of this effort, and what does it do for House Republicans when you have this narrow majority and it's seen as infighting amongst yourselves?
Well, I think it's idiotic. Clearly, some of my colleagues haven't learned the lesson of October, where it took us 3.5 weeks to elect Speaker Johnson after the absurd and stupid removal of Kevin McCarthy. But this is, a continuation of some of my colleagues who continually undermine the majority rather than focus on how to work together as a team. They continue to put their own interests ahead of the conference, ahead of the Congress, and ahead of the country. And I just think it is not helpful, especially 6 months out from an election, to be dealing with nonsense like this.
Do you worry it sends a message to voters that Republicans cannot govern?
I think it sends a message to voters about the overall dysfunction of Washington Look at Senate Democrats. They have not exactly been able to pass very much through the Senate. But it is a continuation of the dysfunction in Washington, which is why voters hold Congress in such low esteem. But from my vantage point, in a district like mine that Joe Biden won by 10 points, that has 80,000 more Democrats than Republicans, I feel good about the work that I'm doing and what we're doing to support my district. And I think voters respect that. So I'm not too concerned about it. But obviously, we have a lot of work to do. And this is a distraction that nobody needs.
Congressman Mike Lawler of the great state of New York, grateful for your time. Have a wonderful week.